The moment Captain Marcus Whitmore's hand closed around the scissors, Lieutenant Elena Vasquez understood that everything she had spent the last 22 months building was about to collapse in less than 15 minutes. His grip was firm but clumsy, the grip of a man used to wielding authority rather than precision instruments, and as he raised the blades toward her shoulder-length brunette hair, she felt the carefully constructed walls of her cover identity begin to fracture like thin ice in spring. She didn't flinch, didn't move, didn't even change her breathing pattern. Her heart rate remained steady at 64 beats per minute, exactly where it should be for someone enduring a moment of calculated humiliation in the office of the commanding officer of Redstone Defense Installation, one of America's most critical military research facilities. But inside, something was breaking. "Hold still, Lieutenant," Whitmore commanded, his voice carrying the irritating certainty of someone who had spent his entire career getting his way through rank and authority rather than competence. "This won't take long. Consider it a correction to your attitude problem. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." The first cut was aggressive, almost violent. The scissors bit through her hair without the precision of a professional barber, but with the crude determination of a man making a point. 6 inches of her carefully maintained brunette locks fell to the polished floor of his office like casualties in a war she had never agreed to fight. Elena watched the strands settle on the carpet, dark brown against gray, and felt something shift in her mind. A door that had been locked for nearly 2 years was beginning to open. Redstone Defense Installation sat like a fortress in the Colorado high country, sprawling across 47,000 acres of mountains and valleys that had been classified as military property since 1941. It wasn't a base in the traditional sense, no aircraft, no soldiers in formation, no visible military infrastructure. Instead, it housed the Defense Department's most sensitive research facilities, materials science labs working on stealth technologies, quantum computing research that didn't officially exist, electromagnetic systems so classified that even their names were compartmented above most security clearances. And for the past 22 months, Elena had been living a lie inside these mountains, pretending to be something she absolutely was not. Her official position listed her as Lieutenant Elena Vasquez, Materials Science Specialist, assigned to the Advanced Composites Research Division. Her security clearance was documented as secret level, standard for someone who might occasionally handle classified equipment but wasn't trusted with anything truly sensitive. Her performance evaluations were consistently adequate, good enough to keep her employed, but not impressive enough to warrant attention or promotion. She was designed to be invisible, unremarkable, forgettable. The kind of person who could walk through secure corridors and no one would notice. The kind of person who could access classified systems and leave no traces. The reality was far more complex and infinitely more dangerous. Elena was not Lieutenant Vasquez. She was Commander Elena Vasquez, United States Navy, assigned to the Defense Intelligence Agency's Advanced Reconnaissance and Penetration Division, a unit so classified that fewer than 30 people in the entire government knew about its existence. Her actual mission at Redstone was part of something codenamed Sentinel Protocol, a long-term operation designed to test the security of America's most critical defense research installation. For 22 months, she had been living a double life. By day, fixing material science problems and attending mundane research meetings. By night, conducting operations that would terrify the people around her if they only understood what she was actually capable of doing. She could manipulate classified databases without leaving electronic footprints. She could access encrypted communication systems using techniques that theoretical computer scientists were still debating the feasibility of. She could map the electromagnetic vulnerabilities of the facility's entire defensive infrastructure and turn those vulnerabilities into weapons that could disable critical systems with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. She had spent nearly 2 years learning every weakness, every blind spot, every assumption that made Redstone believe it was secure. And now Captain Marcus Whitmore was cutting her hair with the kind of crude authority that suggested he had absolutely no idea who he was actually dealing with. "You know your problem, Elena?" Whitmore continued, making another aggressive cut. His hands weren't steady, a tremor that suggested either age or stress. Probably stress. "You think you're smarter than everyone around you. You think because you work with complex research materials, you're somehow above basic military courtesy. Well, I'm going to teach you that no one is above the chain of command. He had invented the reason for this punishment, of course. 3 weeks ago, during a facility security briefing, Elena had asked a technical question about the authenticity of some of the compartmented information he had presented. Not with disrespect, not with insubordination, but with the kind of thoughtful inquiry that her real position required, asking for clarification about procedures and protocols that didn't quite add up. Whitmore had interpreted her question as a public challenge to his authority. He had been wrong about that interpretation, but Elena couldn't correct him without revealing why she actually understood the security protocols better than he did. So she had waited, and 3 weeks later, here she was, standing motionless in his office while he demonstrated his authority by destroying one of the small things that made her feel human after nearly 2 years of calculated deception. Another cut. Hair fell. The pile on the floor was growing, evidence of her humiliation, visible proof of his dominance over her. "You're part of the problem with the modern military," Whitmore said, his voice taking on the tone of a man delivering a lecture he had rehearsed many times. "Too many people like you. Too many specialists who think their technical knowledge exempts them from normal military discipline. You need to remember that you're in the military first, Lieutenant. Everything else, your expertise, your intelligence, your so-called competence, comes second to proper respect for rank and authority." Elena knew he was wrong about nearly everything he was saying. She understood modern warfare in ways that Whitmore, whose last operational assignment had been 15 years ago, could barely comprehend. She understood the invisible battlefields of electronic warfare, cyber operations, and information dominance in ways that would make his conventional understanding of military strategy seem like antique thinking. But none of that mattered in this moment, because she was trapped in a paradox. To defend herself would be to reveal herself. To stay silent was to endure something that was pushing her psychological conditioning to its breaking point. The scissors moved again. This time they caught her scalp. Not accident, but evidence of Whitmore's increasing agitation. She felt the sharp sting of metal against skin, then warm blood beginning to seep from a shallow cut on her head. "Did that hurt?" Whitmore asked, noticing her slight wince. "Good. Maybe pain will help you remember this lesson better than mere words could." Elena stood perfectly still, forcing her breathing to remain controlled, her heart rate to stay stable, forcing her mind to compartmentalize the violation she was experiencing into the carefully separated boxes that her training had taught her to maintain. The Lieutenant Vasquez persona was enduring the punishment. The Commander Vasquez consciousness was observing from a distance, analyzing, documenting, filing the moment away in memory with the precision of a classified intelligence report. But as the scissors continued their work, cutting away more of her hair, more of her identity, more of the small things that made her feel like something other than a ghost haunting the corridors of Redstone, something was shifting in that carefully maintained psychological architecture. For nearly 2 years, she had been suppressing every instinct, every capability, every aspect of her true competence. She had smiled and nodded while receiving correction on procedures she had helped develop. She had submitted to authority structures she understood could be dismantled with a few keystrokes. She had endured being treated as insignificant by people whose understanding of actual security vulnerabilities was dangerously naive. All of that suppression had accumulated like pressure in a sealed container. And right now, watching chunks of her brunette hair fall to the floor of Captain Whitmore's office, Elena felt the container beginning to crack. "Almost finished," Whitmore announced, examining his crude work. "Once we're done here, you'll be a visible reminder to everyone on this installation that there are consequences for not showing proper respect. Your new appearance will speak louder than any words I could say." Elena looked at her reflection in the polished surface of a framed certificate hanging on his wall. A reflection that showed a woman being systematically stripped of one of the small things that made her feel like herself. Her hair, once carefully maintained and styled with military precision, was now a chaotic collection of uneven patches, some cut nearly to her scalp while others retained enough length to emphasize the random cruelty of what Whitmore was doing. As the final cuts fell and Whitmore stepped back to admire his work, Elena felt something shift deep in her psychological framework. The walls that had kept Commander Elena Vasquez compartmentalized from Lieutenant Elena Vasquez were developing hairline fractures. The psychological conditioning that had allowed her to function in deep cover was beginning to break down under the weight of an assault that the conditioning protocols had never fully anticipated. "There," Whitmore said finally, satisfied with his crude handiwork. "That's what military discipline looks like, Lieutenant. Perhaps now you'll remember your place in the hierarchy." Elena turned slowly to face him, and in her eyes was something that made Captain Marcus Whitmore take an involuntary step backward. Not anger, not fear, not any of the emotions he expected to see from someone who had just been humiliated. What he saw was something far more dangerous: absolute clarity of purpose. In that moment, Elena understood that the careful disguise she had maintained for 22 months had just been shattered by a pair of scissors and a general's ignorance. And she understood something else with crystal certainty. She was done pretending. The Colorado morning was brittle with winter cold, the kind of cold that made the air feel sharp enough to cut skin. Elena Vasquez stood on the observation platform overlooking Redstone Defense Installation's primary research complex, watching the landscape unfold below her like a classified topographic map, mountains rising like fortress walls, valleys cutting through them like veins carrying secrets instead of blood, and nestled within those valleys, the sprawling infrastructure of one of America's most sensitive military research facilities. Redstone had been established in 1941 as a classified artillery testing ground. Over the next 80 years, it had evolved into something far more significant: the epicenter of the Defense Department's most advanced research programs. If you wanted to understand how the American military maintained its technological edge over adversaries who were rapidly closing the gap, Redstone was where that edge was being sharpened. Materials science labs that developed stealth composites. Quantum computing research that didn't officially exist in any government database. Electromagnetic systems research that pushed the boundaries of what was theoretically possible. Electronic warfare capabilities that existed in classified specifications so compartmented that even military planners at the Pentagon didn't fully understand what they could actually do. The installation sprawled across 47,000 acres, roughly the size of a small country, and employed over 8,000 personnel. Scientists, engineers, military officers, civilian contractors, and support staff. All of them operating under the assumption that Redstone was secure, that the compartmented security protocols were effective, that the isolation of their location and the rigor of their personnel screening meant that no one could get inside and compromise what they were protecting. All of them were wrong. Elena had been proving that they were wrong for 22 months. She turned away from the observation platform and made her way toward the materials science building, her pace measured and efficient, the pace of someone who had learned to make herself invisible through controlled, unremarkable movement. She wore the standard military uniform for civilian contractors working on classified projects. Khaki pants, gray button-up shirt, the kind of nondescript clothing that blended into the background of military installations worldwide. Her identification badge, clipped to her shirt pocket, identified her as LT Elena Vasquez, material science specialist, secret level clearance, assigned to Advanced Composites Research Division. None of that information was false, technically, but all of it was incomplete. The true nature of Redstone's existence was something that the base commander, Captain Marcus Whitmore, understood only partially. He knew it was important. He knew it was classified. He knew that every person on the installation had been vetted by security personnel and approved to work with sensitive research. What he didn't know was that one of those vetted personnel was actively conducting classified operations designed specifically to exploit the vulnerabilities in his security procedures. Whitmore had taken command of Redstone 18 months ago, brought in from a desk job at the Pentagon to provide what the Defense Intelligence Agency called fresh leadership perspective on base security protocols. He was 56 years old, career military, with the kind of conventional thinking that had characterized the Pentagon's approach to security for the past 3 decades. He believed in visible authority, rigid hierarchy, and the power of rank to enforce compliance. He believed that military discipline meant making subordinates understand their place in the chain of command. He believed that the best security came from having strong leadership and clear procedures. He was, in nearly every meaningful way, exactly the kind of command officer that Elena's true mission required her to study. The Sentinel protocol wasn't officially acknowledged in any classified database that Whitmore had access to. That was the whole point. His superior officers, the people actually coordinating Elena's activities, wanted to understand whether a properly trained intelligence operative could conduct an extended penetration operation inside one of America's most secure facilities without detection. They wanted to know if the security protocols that Redstone relied on were actually effective or just theater designed to make people feel secure. Elena was the answer to that question. She had been the answer for 22 months. Her cover identity had been constructed with meticulous care. She had legitimate credentials as a materials scientist, a master's degree from Stanford in advanced composites engineering, published research papers, professional certifications. Her background had been created to withstand any security investigation that Redstone's personnel screening process could mount. Her personal history had been woven into databases, corroborated by people who had been carefully briefed about her cover story, made real through the accumulated detail that made a false identity indistinguishable from a real one. But maintaining that identity required constant performance. Every day, she had to suppress capabilities and knowledge that her real position gave her. She had to pretend that she didn't understand classified research concepts that she had actually helped develop in Defense Intelligence Agency laboratories. She had to accept correction from supervisors whose understanding of advanced materials science was decades behind current classified research. She had to smile and nod and perform the role of Lieutenant Elena Vasquez while her true consciousness, Commander Elena Vasquez, observed everything, documented everything, analyzed everything. The psychological toll of that performance had been carefully managed through conditioning protocols developed by the Defense Intelligence Agency's Psychological Operations Division. Elena had undergone months of training designed to compartmentalize her identity into separate psychological spaces. The lieutenant persona handled day-to-day interactions, social engagement, normal military functioning. The commander consciousness operated in a separate compartment, observing but not interfering, gathering intelligence but not acting on it, remaining dormant until the mission parameters required activation. For 22 months, that compartmentalization had held. The materials science building was identical to the other research facilities that dotted Redstone's landscape, concrete and steel construction designed to withstand both conventional attack and electromagnetic pulse. Security was visible everywhere. Cameras in corners, card readers on doors, security personnel conducting random inspections of work areas. The illusion of security was comprehensive and convincing. Most people working in the building believed they were part of a well-protected operation, that their research was safe from foreign intelligence services, that their work couldn't be compromised without someone detecting the compromise. Elena knew better. She had spent 22 months mapping exactly how that security could be compromised. She entered the Advanced Composites Lab using her access badge, one of dozens of personnel moving through the corridors during the morning shift. Her supervisor, Dr. David Chun, was already at his workstation reviewing test results from the previous day's research. Chun was a civilian scientist, genuinely brilliant in his field, and completely unaware that the junior officer working in his lab was conducting an intelligence assessment of every classification marking in his lab, every compartmented procedure he used, every security protocol that governed access to his research. "Morning, Elena," Chin said without looking up. "I need you to run the stress analysis on the new composite batch from yesterday. The manufacturing specs changed slightly, and I want to make sure we're still within acceptable parameters." "Of course, Dr. Chen," Elena replied, her voice carrying the professional courtesy of a junior officer addressing a senior scientist. "I'll have the analysis completed by end of shift." She moved to her assigned workstation, logged into the classified computer system using credentials that were scanned and verified against multiple authentication protocols, and accessed the research database. On the surface, she was reviewing routine materials science data, stress analysis, failure point calculations, manufacturing specifications. Below the surface, she was conducting something far more significant. Every keystroke was registered in security logs that Elena had already identified as vulnerable to specific manipulation techniques. Every file she accessed was tracked by systems that she knew could be spoofed using equipment that cost less than a laptop computer. Every security protocol that was designed to prevent unauthorized access to classified information contained logical vulnerabilities that would have been obvious if anyone had actually thought to look for them. But no one was looking because everyone at Redstone operated under the assumption that security came from authority and compartmentalization, not from actually understanding how their own systems worked. The morning passed in the routine rhythm of unclassified work. Elena performed her duties as Lieutenant Vasquez, contributing to research that was genuinely important from a technical perspective, participating in team meetings where she offered insights that were carefully calibrated to be helpful without revealing the depth of her actual knowledge. She smiled at appropriate moments, nodded at the right times, performed the role of a competent junior officer who was exactly what her cover identity claimed to be. Around 1,400 hours, she received a message on the military communications system. A single line of text: report to base commander's office at 0600 hours tomorrow. Routine personnel briefing. Elena read the message twice, analyzing every word for hidden meaning. There was no indication of trouble, no suggestion that her cover had been compromised or that her activities had been discovered. It was almost certainly a routine administrative meeting, the kind that the base commander conducted periodically with various personnel. Almost certainly. But Elena's training had taught her to think beyond probabilities and statistical likelihood. She had learned to consider possibilities that most people wouldn't imagine. What if this wasn't routine? What if something had changed? What if the compartmentation that had protected her for 22 months had somehow been breached? She filed the message away in her memory with the precision of a classified intelligence report, noting every detail, preparing for contingencies that she hoped would never be necessary. As the day shifted toward evening and she prepared to leave the research facility, Elena had no way of knowing that the 0600 hours meeting would become the moment when everything changed. That Captain Marcus Whitmore would interpret a routine technical question in a way that triggered his need to assert dominance. That he would make a decision that seemed minor at the time but would prove to be catastrophic in ways that neither of them could have predicted. She simply logged out of her workstation, submitted her research results to Dr. Chun, and walked out into the Colorado afternoon, where mountains stood like witnesses to secrets that were about to be revealed. 22 months earlier, Elena Vasquez had arrived at Redstone Defense Installation on a Tuesday morning in May, stepping out of a nondescript military transport vehicle with a single duffel bag containing everything she would need to begin her life as a ghost. The May sun had been warm, the Colorado mountains had been stunning, and the security checkpoint at the main gate had processed her credentials with the kind of routine efficiency that suggested no one had any idea they were letting a classified intelligence operative inside one of America's most sensitive military research facilities. Her cover story was simple but comprehensive. She was a civilian contractor with legitimate credentials from Stanford University, a master's degree in advanced materials engineering, published research papers in peer-reviewed journals, and professional certifications that would withstand any technical scrutiny. Her background had been woven into government databases over the preceding 6 months: security clearance investigations, employment records, educational transcripts, all meticulously constructed to create the appearance of a real person who had lived a real life before arriving at Redstone. The Defense Intelligence Agency had spent approximately 18 months preparing Elena for this assignment. The preparation had occurred at a facility in Northern Virginia that officially didn't exist, in buildings that didn't appear on any organizational chart, under the supervision of instructors whose names were classified. Her training had covered everything from advanced materials science to military protocol to the specific psychological techniques required to maintain a false identity while living under constant observation. But the most critical part of her preparation hadn't involved technical knowledge or cover story construction. It had involved learning how to suppress herself, how to take Commander Elena Vasquez, a woman with 2 decades of classified operational experience, with expertise in infiltration and intelligence gathering, with capabilities that had been honed through training programs that theoretically shouldn't exist, and lock that person away in a compartmented part of her consciousness where she could observe but not interfere, could gather intelligence but not act on it, could watch people make mistakes but couldn't correct them. The compartmentalization protocols that the Defense Intelligence Agency had taught her were sophisticated psychological techniques developed by their Behavioral Analysis Division. They worked by creating mental barriers between different aspects of identity, allowing Elena to maintain her lieutenant persona during the day while her commander consciousness remained dormant in the background, observing everything but unable to overwrite the primary personality layer that was responsible for social interaction and routine functioning. For 22 months, those protocols had worked flawlessly. Dr. David Chun, the head of the Advanced Composites Research Division, had been her first supervisor. He was a brilliant scientist in his 50s, a civilian who had spent his entire career working on classified research programs. When Elena had reported to his lab that first Tuesday in May, he had evaluated her with the professional assessment of someone used to working with various personnel who rotated through research positions. "Welcome to the division, Lieutenant Vasquez," he had said, shaking her hand with the kind of formal courtesy that characterized interactions between military officers and senior civilian scientists. "I've reviewed your background materials. Your materials science credentials are impressive. Stanford, published research, relevant experience. I think you'll fit well with our team here." What Chun didn't know was that Elena's credentials were designed to be slightly better than necessary, impressive enough to be credible, but not so exceptional as to warrant special attention. The Defense Intelligence Agency had learned through decades of penetration operations that the key to successful infiltration was never to excel too brilliantly. Excellence attracted attention. Attention created scrutiny. Scrutiny compromised operations. So Elena had performed consistently well but never exceptionally. She had contributed meaningfully to research projects but never solved critical problems with suspicious speed. She had learned everything about Redstone's research procedures without demonstrating knowledge that should have been impossible for someone in her position to possess. She had become the perfect subordinate, competent, reliable, and completely forgettable. The first year had been about understanding the physical layout of Redstone. Elena had deliberately developed routines that took her through different sections of the installation. She ran on the base fitness track where she could observe the security perimeter. She ate in different sections of the dining facility where she could observe security personnel and their patterns. She participated in various base activities where she could catalog guard rotations, camera placements, and access control procedures. The second year had transitioned to understanding Redstone's electronic infrastructure. Elena had gained access to classified computer systems through her legitimate job responsibilities, but she had also identified and documented vulnerabilities in those systems that would have terrified Redstone's security officer if he had known they existed. She had mapped network topologies, identified encryption keys, and documented the procedures by which compartmented information was protected and transmitted. Her true supervisor, the Defense Intelligence Agency handler who she met once per month at carefully arranged locations outside Redstone, had been impressed by the comprehensiveness of her intelligence gathering. Major James Torres, a career intelligence officer who had conducted penetration operations in more countries than most Americans could name, had reviewed Elena's reports with the careful attention of someone evaluating the work of a subordinate. "You're doing exceptional work, Commander," Torres had said during their most recent meeting, conducted in a secure facility 2 hours away from Redstone. "Your assessment of Redstone's vulnerability landscape is more comprehensive than anything we anticipated during the planning phase. The Defense Intelligence Agency leadership is particularly impressed with your documentation of how the compartmented security protocols break down when you trace the information flows across different divisions." Elena had simply nodded. She had learned long ago that debriefing sessions with intelligence handlers weren't conversations in the normal sense. They were one-way information transfers from operative to handler, with occasional questions designed to clarify details or request additional focus on specific areas of interest. "The next phase begins in approximately 8 months, Torres had continued. "By that point, we'll have enough documentation of Redstone's vulnerabilities to begin planning remediation. Your job at that point transitions from passive intelligence gathering to active demonstration. You'll be authorized to implement selected exploits designed to prove that someone with your capabilities could actually disable critical systems if they wanted to." Elena had understood the implications. Passive intelligence gathering had required her to remain invisible, to collect information without alerting anyone to her presence or true mission. Active demonstration would require her to actually reveal her capabilities, to show Redstone's leadership exactly how vulnerable they really were, and in the process almost certainly compromise her cover identity entirely. But that was still 8 months away when they had that conversation. Plenty of time for Redstone's leadership to adjust to the reality of their own vulnerabilities. Plenty of time for the compartmentation protocols to be reinforced. Plenty of time to prepare psychologically for the moment when she would stop being Lieutenant Elena Vasquez and start being Commander Elena Vasquez again. What Elena hadn't anticipated was that Captain Marcus Whitmore would accelerate that timeline by 3 weeks through nothing more than a moment of wounded ego and a pair of scissors. When Whitmore had arrived at Redstone 18 months ago, Elena had evaluated him with the clinical assessment of someone trained to understand human behavior at a granular level. She had recognized the signs of someone whose military authority had become intertwined with his sense of personal worth. Someone who needed to be respected not because of his actual competence, but because his position demanded it. Someone who would eventually interpret a routine technical question as a personal challenge to his authority. She just hadn't expected that interpretation to come during a formal administrative meeting in his office. She hadn't expected him to decide that the appropriate response was to physically assault her while claiming to be enforcing military discipline. She hadn't anticipated that his crude attempt to humiliate her would crack the psychological compartmentation that 18 months of training had designed to be virtually unbreakable. But here she was, standing in his office with her hair being cut away as punishment for daring to question his understanding of security procedures. And as she watched the pieces of herself fall to the floor, Elena understood that something fundamental was changing in her psychological architecture. The walls that had kept her two identities separated were developing fractures. The lieutenant persona that had performed flawlessly for 22 months was losing control. And the commander consciousness that had been waiting dormant in the background was beginning to awaken. By the time Whitmore finished cutting her hair and she left his office, Elena understood with absolute certainty that the demonstration phase of Sentinel Protocol was about to accelerate far beyond anyone's expectations. She was done pretending to be insignificant. Elena's quarters at Redstone were a study in controlled minimalism. The small officer housing unit designated Building 7, Room 204, contained exactly what military regulations required and nothing more. A single bunk bed with a foam mattress covered in regulation gray sheets. A metal desk with a chair. A wall locker for uniforms and personal items. A small bathroom with basic fixtures. A window that overlooked the western perimeter of the base, where searchlights swept across the Colorado darkness every 90 seconds in a pattern that Elena had long since memorized. She had deliberately arranged her quarters to reveal nothing about who she actually was. No photographs from her childhood. No mementos from previous assignments. No personal items that might spark curiosity or conversation from the few base personnel who ever had occasion to visit. The wall locker contained precisely 3 uniforms in perfect condition, each pressed with creases sharp enough to cut glass. The desk held exactly 2 items. A laptop computer issued by Redstone's IT department for accessing classified research materials, and a leather-bound notebook, worn soft from being carried through countless missions over 2 decades of classified operations. The notebook was the only personal item that Elena permitted herself to keep, and it represented perhaps the greatest security risk she took during her time at Redstone. Military intelligence protocols explicitly prohibited operatives from maintaining personal journals or records during deep cover operations. Any physical documentation of an operative's actual thoughts or observations created potential vulnerability. If the notebook were discovered, Elena's entire cover identity would collapse instantly. The Defense Intelligence Agency had strict guidelines about such things, and Elena knew that carrying the notebook violated those guidelines. But she carried it anyway, because after 22 months of suppressing her true consciousness, she needed some way to maintain her psychological integrity. The notebook was where Commander Elena Vasquez lived while Lieutenant Elena Vasquez performed her daily responsibilities. It was her anchor to her actual identity, the evidence that underneath the cover story, she was still a person with thoughts, observations, and a continuity of consciousness that extended beyond the current mission. She kept the notebook locked in her wall locker inside a waterproof container disguised as maintenance equipment, the kind of innocuous storage that security personnel conducting random quarters inspections wouldn't think to examine. Every evening, after she returned from Redstone's research facilities, Elena would remove the notebook and spend 1 hour documenting her observations in a personal code that she had developed during her initial training. Not the kind of code that a professional cryptanalyst couldn't break, but sophisticated enough that a casual reader wouldn't understand it. The entries were detailed, not emotionally overwrought. Elena had learned to maintain professional distance from her own emotional responses, but clinically precise in the way that career intelligence officers documented information they believed would be useful later. May 15, 2023. 4 weeks into assignment. Dr. Chun appears to trust my technical competence. No indication of suspicion regarding my background. Research Division operates with minimal security oversight. Dr. Chun serves as both technical supervisor and security authority. Vulnerability. Single point of failure for compartmented information access. If Dr. Chen's systems were compromised, access to advanced composites research could be obtained without triggering standard security alerts. June 3, 2023. Identified vulnerability in GPS tracking system used for personnel movement monitoring. System relies on outdated encryption protocols. Could be spoofed using equipment worth less than $2,000. Recommendation. Classify as critical risk in final assessment report. August 12, 2023. Psychological stress increasing. 20 hours per day of performance is creating measurable fatigue in compartmentalization protocols. Lieutenant persona experiencing micro-expressions of frustration during routine interactions. Need to increase meditation protocols to maintain psychological stability. The entries continued chronologically through her 22 months at Redstone. Some were technical observations about security vulnerabilities. Others were psychological notes about the stress of maintaining her cover identity. A few were more personal, observations about other personnel, small moments of human connection that she had to suppress, feelings about the isolation of her assignment that she had no one to share with. Elena's daily routine was meticulously structured to balance the demands of her cover identity with the requirements of her intelligence-gathering mission. She woke at 0530 hours each morning, a habit ingrained from her years of military service long before Redstone. She performed 30 minutes of physical exercise in the small space of her quarters, push-ups, pull-ups from the door frame, stretching routines designed to maintain physical conditioning without leaving the quarters or requiring access to base fitness facilities where she might be observed by base personnel who had no legitimate reason to know her exercise patterns. At 0600 hours, she showered and dressed in her uniform for the day. The routine of dressing was itself a form of psychological preparation. Putting on the uniform was the moment when Lieutenant Elena Vasquez came to life. The commander consciousness would retreat into the background compartment, prepared to observe but not interfere with the performance that would occupy the next 14 to 16 hours. At 0700 hours, she would eat breakfast in the officers' dining facility, sitting at a table with personnel from different divisions. She had carefully cultivated a reputation for being social but reserved, friendly enough not to seem distant or suspicious, but not so engaged that she became part of anyone's close social circle. Friendship was a vulnerability. Friends asked questions. Friends wanted to know personal details. Friends noticed inconsistencies. Elena couldn't afford friends. The bulk of her day, from 0800 hours until 1700 hours, was spent in the Advanced Composites Research Division where she performed her official duties as a materials science specialist. These weren't cover activities. The research she contributed to was genuine, the technical problems she helped solve were real, and her contributions were legitimately valuable to Dr. Chen's division. But they also provided perfect cover for the intelligence gathering that occurred in the spaces between official duties. She accessed classified computer systems under the pretext of conducting research. She photographed compartmented documents using miniature cameras that appeared to be identification badge accessories. She eavesdropped on security briefings while pretending to work quietly at her desk. She documented procedures for accessing classified areas, observed security personnel patterns, and identified the relationships between different divisions that might reveal information compartmentation weaknesses. After work hours, Elena maintained physical discipline that most military officers would have considered excessive. She ran 5 miles on the base perimeter track, timing her runs to different hours to observe how security patterns varied throughout the day. She attended mandatory base social functions where she observed the informal power networks that existed outside official chain of command structures. She participated in classified information security briefings that provided explicit details about what Redstone was protecting and how they believed it should be protected. Every evening, she recorded her observations. Every night, she performed meditation and psychological conditioning exercises designed to prevent the compartmentalization protocols from deteriorating. Every day was an exercise in calculated performance, in suppressing who she actually was while pretending to be someone she absolutely was not. The meals she ate were nutritionally calculated. She consumed approximately 2,200 calories per day, enough to maintain her physical capabilities, not enough to gain weight that might alter her physical appearance and trigger observation from people who might notice such changes. She drank coffee because that's what Lieutenant Elena Vasquez would do, though she had no emotional investment in the coffee itself. She smiled at the appropriate moments during conversations, even when nothing was actually amusing. She participated in small talk about base activities and research progress, all the while maintaining psychological distance from the performance. She learned the names and family situations of her fellow officers and staff, not because she cared about those details, but because knowing personal information about the people around her was tactically useful. People revealed information when they felt personally connected. If Elena could create the illusion of personal connection while maintaining absolute psychological isolation, she could gather information that compartmented security protocols were specifically designed to protect. By the end of each day, as she lay in her bunk and prepared for sleep, Elena had conducted approximately 40 separate intelligence-gathering activities, documented dozens of observations about Redstone's vulnerabilities, and maintained a cover identity that had convinced everyone around her that she was exactly what her records claimed to be. For 22 months, she had perfected the art of being someone she was not, of existing as a ghost inside her own life, of performing competence while suppressing capability, of being simultaneously visible and invisible, present but forgotten, powerful but powerless. And then Captain Marcus Whitmore had decided that she needed to be taught a lesson about military discipline, and everything she had spent 22 months building had begun to collapse. The photograph was 12 years old, worn soft from being carried through 3 wars, 4 continents, and countless missions that had tested the limits of human endurance. Elena kept it secured in a waterproof compartment within the leather-bound notebook, not because military protocol permitted it, but because she needed the reminder of why she had chosen to live as a ghost inside her own life. The image showed a young man with Elena's dark eyes and the kind of smile that suggested he had never questioned whether the world was fundamentally fair or whether good intentions were sufficient to prevent tragedy. His name had been Lieutenant James Vasquez. He had been her brother. He had been 24 years old when an insurgent's improvised explosive device had turned a routine patrol in Kandahar into a catastrophe that changed Elena's understanding of how the world actually worked. Elena had been 22 at the time, freshly graduated from her initial selection course for the Defense Intelligence Agency, when she received the notification that her brother had been killed in action. The notification had been delivered in person by 2 uniformed officers who showed appropriate solemnity while delivering information that was supposed to be about James, but which actually seemed to be about bureaucratic procedures and proper notification protocols. James had been a combat engineer. His job had been to identify and neutralize improvised explosive devices, the same devices that insurgent organizations used to kill American military personnel with systematic precision. He had been good at his job. His commanding officers had described him as dedicated, careful, and courageous. His fellow soldiers had liked him. His parents had been proud of him. None of that had mattered on the day when the device he was attempting to neutralize had been more sophisticated than his training had prepared him to handle. None of that had mattered when the explosion had occurred. None of that had mattered to the fact that his body had been shipped back to the United States in a flag-draped casket for a funeral that Elena had attended while still processing the surreal reality that her brother, the person who had taught her how to ride a bicycle, who had encouraged her when she wanted to join the military, who had always believed that service meant something, was now dead. The funeral had been held at Arlington National Cemetery on a day when the weather had been inappropriately beautiful. Elena had stood at the gravesite wearing her dress uniform, watching the honor guard perform the ceremonial folding of the flag that had draped her brother's casket. She had watched her mother break down and her father stand in rigid silence. She had watched military personnel who had known James deliver eulogies about his character and sacrifice. and she had understood something that had fundamentally altered her trajectory within the Defense Intelligence Agency. James had died doing a job that required him to move toward threats rather than away from them. He had died because the military systems that were supposed to identify and neutralize improvised explosive devices had been inadequate to the actual threats they faced. He had died because the intelligence that was supposed to prevent attacks had failed. He had died because the security protocols and defensive systems that were supposed to keep soldiers alive had proven insufficient. Elena had returned to Defense Intelligence Agency headquarters 3 days after James's funeral and requested a meeting with the director of the Advanced Reconnaissance and Penetration Division. She had been 22 years old, barely through her initial selection, with no operational experience and no clear basis for requesting a meeting with someone of that rank. The director had agreed to see her, perhaps out of sympathy for her recent loss, or perhaps because something in her personnel file suggested she might be worth a few minutes of his time. The meeting had lasted 40 minutes. Elena had explained her theory about how security failures happened at military installations. She had discussed the gaps between what security protocols claimed to accomplish and what they actually accomplished in practice. She had outlined a comprehensive approach to testing security vulnerabilities through long-term penetration operations that would identify not just physical security weaknesses but the institutional blind spots that prevented organizations from recognizing threats even when those threats were operating openly within their perimeters. The director had listened without interrupting. When Elena had finished, he had been quiet for a long moment before responding. What you're describing requires someone willing to spend years living as someone they're not. It requires suppressing everything that makes you who you actually are. It requires psychological compartmentalization that most people would find unsustainable. Why would you volunteer for something like that? Elena had answered without hesitation. Because my brother died because security systems failed. Because there were probably intelligence gaps that could have prevented his death if someone had identified them. Because I can identify those gaps and I can document what organizations do wrong when they believe they're secure but actually aren't. She had paused, understanding that what she was about to say crossed the line between professional motivation and personal vendetta. And because if I can prevent one other person's brother from dying for the same reasons James died, then spending years performing a false identity seems like a reasonable trade. The director had nodded slowly. How long would you be willing to commit to something like this? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As long as it takes, Elena had said. However long the mission requires. That conversation had led to her recruitment into the Sentinel Protocol. It had led to 18 months of intensive preparation. It had led to her arrival at Redstone Defense Installation, where she had spent 22 months building the most comprehensive assessment of institutional security vulnerabilities that the Defense Intelligence Agency had ever documented. The photograph of James remained in Elena's locked compartment, even though she knew it was a security risk. She knew that if her quarters were ever comprehensively searched, if anyone ever discovered the notebook, the presence of the photograph would instantly compromise her cover identity and raise questions about her psychological stability that would result in immediate termination of her assignment. But every evening, Elena would remove that photograph and spend 5 minutes looking at her brother's face. She would remember the sound of his laugh. She would recall conversations they had shared before she joined the military and their paths had diverged. She would remind herself why she had volunteered to stop being Elena Vasquez and become Lieutenant Elena Vasquez instead. James had died because the military's understanding of security had been inadequate to the actual threats it faced. Elena was going to fix that. She was going to spend years living as a ghost so that her documentation of security vulnerabilities would force the Defense Department to recognize the gaps that had gotten her brother killed. That was the driving force that had sustained her through 22 months of psychological compartmentalization. That was why she could endure being dismissed as incompetent when she knew her actual capabilities exceeded those of everyone around her. That was why she could accept correction from supervisors whose understanding of classified research was decades behind what she actually knew. That was why she could smile and perform and suppress her true consciousness day after day. It was because every security vulnerability she documented, every institutional blind spot she revealed, Every gap she identified between perceived security and actual security was a step toward preventing another James from dying unnecessarily. The week after James's death, his commanding officer had written to Elena's family. In the letter, he had described James as someone who had believed that protecting others was worth the risk. Elena had taken that description as a mandate. She had transformed her grief into mission. She had taken her brother's death and weaponized it into a driving force that would reshape how the military understood its own vulnerabilities. But that motivation came with a psychological cost. It meant that she couldn't allow herself to see her sacrifice as comparable to James's. It meant that every moment of isolation, every suppressed emotion, every performance of false identity had to be justified by the understanding that she was preventing future Jameses from dying because of security failures that could have been identified and prevented if anyone had thought to look. By the time Elena reached Redstone, she had internalized that motivation so completely that it had become indistinguishable from her actual consciousness. She had become someone who could endure nearly anything because enduring it meant honoring her brother's sacrifice by preventing similar sacrifices from being necessary in the future. And then Captain Marcus Whitmore had cut her hair with crude scissors and treated her like she was an incompetent junior officer who needed discipline. And for the first time in 12 years, Elena had allowed herself to question whether preventing future deaths was worth the cost of destroying her own humanity in the process. Captain Marcus Whitmore had arrived at Redstone Defense Installation on a gray November morning 18 months into Elena's assignment, and she had known within the first 47 seconds of observing him that he represented a category of threat that the Defense Intelligence Agency's threat assessment protocols hadn't adequately prepared her to handle. Not because he was competent or particularly intelligent. Not because he represented an external security risk that might compromise her mission. But because he was the kind of commander who believed that his authority derived from rank rather than capability, and that belief would eventually put him into direct conflict with someone who understood security systems better than he did. The official announcement of his assignment had come through base communication channels in the routine military style. Please join us in welcoming Captain Marcus Whitmore, newly assigned as commanding officer of Redstone Defense Installation. Captain Whitmore brings 15 years of military experience and a commitment to operational excellence in protecting America's most critical defense research. Elena had read the announcement with the clinical assessment of someone trained to understand human behavior through written communication patterns. 15 years of military experience. The phrasing was carefully vague. It didn't specify what kind of experience, which typically meant the experience wasn't in direct operational roles. Commitment to operational excellence. The phrase suggested aspiration rather than demonstrated accomplishment. The announcement had been written by someone in Whitmore's public affairs office trying to make him sound more impressive than his actual background probably warranted. The first time Elena encountered Whitmore in person was during a base-wide security briefing 3 weeks after his arrival. The briefing was held in Redstone's large auditorium, with representatives from all divisions attending to receive updates on security protocols and operational expectations. Elena had positioned herself in the middle section of the auditorium, visible but not conspicuous, part of the crowd but not engaged in conversation with anyone adjacent to her. Whitmore had entered from stage left with the bearing of someone accustomed to commanding attention through rank rather than presence. He was 56 years old, gray-haired, with the kind of posture that military academy instruction had drilled into him 4 decades ago. His uniform was immaculate, pressed to military perfection, adorned with various service ribbons that documented a career that had apparently involved significant time in desk jobs rather than operational assignments. He moved across the stage like he was performing military leadership rather than embodying it. The briefing itself had been routine. Whitmore had discussed security procedures, emphasized the importance of compartmented information handling, and stressed his commitment to maintaining the high standards that Redstone was known for throughout the Defense Department. His words had been appropriate. His understanding of security protocols had been adequate. His grasp of the specific classified research that Redstone protected had been superficial at best. Elena had observed and documented all of this with the detached precision of an intelligence analyst. Whitmore represented a potential vulnerability to her mission, but not an immediate threat. He was a conventional military officer brought in to provide conventional military leadership. As long as Elena remained invisible, As long as she performed her role as an unremarkable junior officer with competence but not excellence, she would be beneath his notice. That assessment had held for 18 months. The first sign that Whitmore's attention was beginning to focus on Elena came during a facility inspection in October, 3 weeks before the incident in his office. Whitmore had conducted what he called leadership walks through various base divisions, ostensibly to understand the work being conducted and assess the competence of personnel under his command. In reality, he had been conducting what amounted to management theater, allowing personnel to see him, establishing his visible authority, reminding everyone that he was in charge. The inspection of the Advanced Composites Research Division had been routine until Whitmore had observed Elena working on stress analysis calculations for one of Dr. Chen's research projects. The calculations were complex, involving material properties and failure point analysis that required understanding of advanced composites engineering at a sophisticated level. Elena had been performing the calculations correctly, with the kind of technical precision that demonstrated genuine competence. Whitmore had stopped at her workstation and studied the calculations displayed on her screen for approximately 30 seconds. Elena had maintained her posture and her focus on the work, not wanting to appear as though she was seeking his attention or attempting to impress him. Any excessive engagement with a command officer during his inspection would have violated the carefully cultivated persona of someone who was focused on her work rather than on career advancement or demonstrating her capabilities. These calculations appear quite complex, Whitmore had observed. His tone had suggested something between curiosity and suspicion. "You understand all of this material?" "Yes, sir," Elena had replied with appropriate deference. "I have graduate-level training in materials science. The calculations are straightforward applications of basic engineering principles." It had been a perfectly adequate response. She had acknowledged his observation with military courtesy while providing a brief explanation of her credentials. But she had also, in a way that she hadn't intended, provided information that Whitmore could interpret as suggesting her technical knowledge exceeded what a junior enlisted officer should possess. Whitmore had studied her for a moment longer. "Your background is military or civilian?" "Civilian contractor with military assignments, sir," Elena had answered, which was technically accurate from the perspective of her cover identity. "Navy, assigned to Defense Intelligence Agency liaison." The response had satisfied Whitmore's immediate curiosity. He had moved on to observe other personnel in the division. But Elena had observed the moment when something had shifted in his assessment of her. She had filed the observation away in her leather-bound notebook that evening. Commander's inspection reveals potential vulnerability. Whitmore appears to have interpreted technical competence as presumption or challenge to his authority. Probability of future conflict elevated. The elevation had accelerated 3 weeks later during a classified briefing on facility security protocols. All senior personnel at Redstone were required to attend quarterly briefings where the base's security chief, Major William Torres, reviewed security procedures and updated personnel on any changes to protocols or procedures. During the October briefing, Major Torres had presented updated information about compartmented classification marking procedures. The briefing had included information about how classified information was supposed to be marked, how compartmented information should be separated from non-compartmented classified information, and how personnel should handle information that crossed different classification boundaries. Elena had been listening with the careful attention of someone whose actual mission involved understanding the gaps between how these procedures were supposed to work and how they actually worked in practice. During the briefing, Major Torres had made an assertion about how certain classified materials were compartmented, suggesting that materials with specific classification markings were automatically kept separate from other classified materials through electronic security protocols. But Elena knew, from her 18 months of documentation and her observation of actual base operations, that the electronic security protocols Torres had described didn't actually function the way he claimed they did. She knew there were multiple ways that compartmented information could be accessed by personnel who weren't supposed to have access to it. She knew that the separation Torres was describing existed more in theory than in practice. The knowledge had put Elena in a difficult position. If she remained silent, she would be violating her actual mission, which required identifying and documenting security vulnerabilities. If she asked a question to clarify the discrepancy, She would be drawing attention to herself in front of the base commander and a room full of senior officers. Visibility was dangerous. Drawing attention to security gaps was even more dangerous if that attention came from someone like Whitmore, who seemed increasingly inclined to view her as a potential threat to his authority. Elena had chosen the middle path. She had raised her hand and asked a technical question. "Sir, can you clarify how the compartmented access controls actually prevent unauthorized access when personnel from different divisions need to collaborate on compartmented research? The electronic protocols you described seem to assume that compartmentation lines are always consistent with organizational divisions, but in my observation, that's not always the case." It had been a carefully phrased question. It had been professional, technically grounded, and entirely appropriate for someone with her stated credentials to ask. It had been designed to prompt Major Torres to explain the gap between theory and practice without Elena explicitly pointing out the gap herself. But Whitmore had not heard it as a technical clarification. He had heard it as a junior officer questioning the competence of his security chief. He had heard it as an implicit suggestion that the base commander wasn't adequately informed about how his own security protocols actually functioned. He had heard it as presumption, a lower-ranking officer asserting her expertise over the commander's understanding of his own installation. The room had fallen silent for a moment. Major Torres had offered a technical response that didn't actually address the question Elena had asked. Whitmore had made eye contact with Elena for approximately 4 seconds. A moment of assessment that suggested he was reevaluating his understanding of who she was and what her presence on his base actually meant. After the briefing concluded, Whitmore had approached Major Torres, and Elena had observed them in conversation where Whitmore appeared to be asking questions about Elena's background, her assignment, and why she seemed to have such detailed understanding of security procedures that shouldn't have been relevant to her position in the Materials Science Division. Elena had documented this moment in her notebook that evening. Commander appears to have interpreted technical question as challenge to his authority. His conversational body language with Major Torres suggested suspicion regarding my actual role and background. Probability of future confrontation significantly elevated. Recommend accelerating mission timeline if possible. But the mission timeline couldn't be accelerated. Major James Torres, her Defense Intelligence Agency handler, had been clear about that. The active demonstration phase was scheduled to begin 8 months from the October briefing. Elena would need to maintain her cover identity for those 8 months. She would need to continue being invisible, continue performing her role, continue suppressing her true consciousness while Whitmore's suspicion festered. For the next 3 weeks, Elena had observed Whitmore's behavior shift. He had begun conducting more frequent inspections of the Advanced Composites Research Division. He had started asking Dr. Chun questions about Elena's work and her background. He had paid attention to her in ways that suggested his understanding of threat assessment had been activated, even though he didn't seem to understand what the actual threat might be. Elena had maintained her cover identity perfectly. She had performed competence without excellence. She had been helpful without being exceptional. She had answered questions with military courtesy without elaborating. But she had also understood that something fundamental had changed in Whitmore's perception of her, and that change had set the stage for the moment when he would decide that teaching her a lesson about military discipline and respect for authority was an appropriate use of his command authority. The first week after the October briefing incident was characterized by what Elena classified as visible observation without direct confrontation. Whitmore had begun appearing in the Advanced Composites Research Division with unusual frequency, conducting what he called spot inspections but which Elena recognized as surveillance activities masquerading as command presence. He would walk through the lab at unpredictable times, observe personnel at their workstations with deliberate intensity, and ask questions that seemed designed more to catch people making mistakes than to understand what they were actually accomplishing. Elena had adapted her behavior accordingly. She reduced the complexity of her work during times when Whitmore might appear. She became more vocal about uncertainties in her research, asking Dr. Chun questions instead of solving problems independently. She performed incompetence in visible ways, hesitating over calculations that she understood perfectly, requesting assistance on tasks she could have completed alone, intentionally making small errors that she then caught and corrected after asking for guidance. The performance was exhausting. For 18 months, Elena had maintained a careful balance between being competent enough to be valuable to Dr. Chen's division and unremarkable enough to avoid attention. Now she was actively performing incompetence, which required a different kind of control. She had to make mistakes that were believable but not so significant that they damaged her professional credibility. She had to ask questions that seemed natural rather than strategic. She had to perform uncertainty while maintaining psychological control over the performance. Dr. Chen had noticed the change. Elena could see it in the way he observed her work, the slight concern in his expression when she asked questions about concepts that she had previously demonstrated clear understanding of. On the third day of her new performance routine, Chen had pulled her aside. "Elena, is everything all right?" he had asked, his tone carrying the genuine concern of someone who had worked with her long enough to recognize when something was different. "Your work quality is still fine, but you seem less confident than usual. Are you having personal issues or concerns about the research?" Elena had needed to make a decision in that moment. She could maintain her cover story and suggest that she was simply having an off week. Or she could risk a slightly different approach that might buy her protection from Whitmore's scrutiny while not fully compromising her actual competence. "I think the base commander's inspections have me a bit on edge," she had admitted, which was technically true. "I want to make sure I'm meeting his standards, and I'm trying to be more careful about my work to avoid any issues with how things are being done." The response had been strategically vague. It suggested appropriate nervousness about command attention without revealing that she understood Whitmore's attention was personal rather than professional. Chen had nodded with understanding, and Elena had detected a slight shift in his expression that suggested he was recalibrating his assessment of the situation. He probably assumed that Whitmore had developed some kind of professional concern about the division and that Elena was reacting appropriately to that pressure. "Don't worry too much," Chen had said reassuringly. "The inspections are just Whitmore establishing his authority. He'll settle down once he feels confident that he understands how things work around here." Elena had thanked him and returned to her work. But she had documented the interaction in her evening notebook. Dr. Chen demonstrates typical institutional response to command pressure, assumes authority assertions are routine rather than recognizing potential for conflict. Whitmore's inspections unlikely to decrease unless specific catalyst removed. The second week of mounting tension was characterized by what Elena identified as indirect confrontation through procedural obstruction. Whitmore began implementing new security procedures for the Advanced Composites Research Division that seemed designed primarily to create inconvenience and demonstrate his authority over Dr. Chen's research operations. Security badging procedures were modified to require additional verification before personnel could access classified research areas. Information handling procedures were changed to require additional documentation for compartmented materials. Lab access logs were implemented that required personnel to document not just when they accessed research materials but what specific materials they accessed and how long they accessed them for. On the surface, these procedures could be justified as reasonable security enhancements. In practice, they served primarily to slow down research operations and create bureaucratic obstacles that would require repeated interaction with security personnel who reported directly to Whitmore. Elena had observed the impact on Dr. Chen's division. Productivity had declined by approximately 23% in the first 3 days of the new procedures. Personnel were spending more time documenting their work than actually conducting research. The complex relationships between different research projects, relationships that required personnel to access materials from multiple compartmented research areas, had become more difficult to manage. Dr. Chen had submitted 3 separate requests for modifications to the procedures through official channels. All 3 had been rejected by Whitmore's office with standardized responses suggesting that the procedures were necessary for security and that any further modifications would need to be requested through formal review processes that would require approval from the Defense Intelligence Agency headquarters. Elena had recognized the trap immediately. Whitmore had created procedures that were technically defensible but operationally problematic, then blocked any attempts to modify them by invoking higher authority that would have minimal investment in the specific operations of a single research division. It was a sophisticated form of administrative control, not violent enough to trigger official concern, but calculated enough to demonstrate authority and create frustration among subordinates. The procedures had affected Elena more directly than most personnel in the division. Because she had access to multiple compartmented research areas, justified by her cross-divisional materials science work, the new documentation requirements required her to complete additional paperwork every time she accessed classified materials. She was spending approximately 2 hours per day simply documenting what she had already spent 2 hours per day accessing. Whitmore had begun appearing in the security documentation area where personnel submitted their access logs. He would observe Elena submitting her documentation with obvious satisfaction, as though watching her struggle with administrative burden was confirming something he had suspected about her from the beginning. By the end of the second week, Elena had documented the escalation pattern in her notebook. Whitmore is employing administrative harassment as mechanism for asserting authority. Procedures serve no legitimate security purpose but effectively handicap division operations while remaining technically defensible. Strategy suggests he is aware that direct confrontation regarding competence issue is not viable, instead focusing on control through institutional authority. Probability of direct confrontation increasing. The third week brought a shift in Whitmore's approach. He stopped conducting frequent inspections and stopped appearing in the documentation areas. Instead, he requested formal meetings with senior personnel from various divisions. Meetings held in his office, conducted with official records, carried out with the full weight of command authority behind them. Elena had learned about the meetings from Dr. Chun, who had returned from his meeting with Whitmore looking shaken. He's asking detailed questions about personnel assignments. Chun had mentioned to her during a brief conversation, specifically about your role in the division and how you got assigned to work on compartmented research. I told him that you were assigned through normal channels as a contractor specialist, but he seemed unsatisfied with the answer. That evening, Elena had added a new entry to her notebook. Chen's meeting suggests Whitmore is conducting background investigation into my assignment. He is trying to identify inconsistencies or irregularities that might justify official action against me. This represents transition from general suspicion to targeted investigation. The following day, Elena had received notification through official channels that she was required to meet with Captain Whitmore on the morning of November 19th at 0600 hours for routine personnel briefing and performance review. The notification had been deliberately formal. It had used official military communication channels. It had provided minimal detail about the purpose of the meeting or what specific performance issues would be discussed. It had been designed to create maximum ambiguity about what Whitmore's intentions actually were. Elena had documented the notification and then conducted a comprehensive threat assessment. Whitmore's options for action against her were technically limited by military regulations and official procedures. He couldn't formally charge her with insubordination without documented evidence of failure to follow direct orders. He couldn't remove her from her position without going through official channels that would require approval from her actual supervisors and the Defense Intelligence Agency. He couldn't conduct anything that would be considered a formal investigation without creating documentation that might eventually reach higher authorities. But he could conduct what he would probably justify as a corrective action, conducted through his command authority. He could create a situation that served his emotional need to assert dominance over someone he perceived as challenging his authority, all while maintaining the appearance of legitimate command responsibility. Elena had predicted, with approximately 95% confidence, that whatever Whitmore had planned for the 0600 hours meeting, it would involve some form of public humiliation or physical assertion of authority. She had anticipated that he might order her to change her uniform, modify her appearance, or engage in some form of exercise that would physically demonstrate his power over her. She had not anticipated that he would resort to something as crude as using scissors to cut her hair. But she had understood, by the evening before the meeting, that her ability to maintain her cover identity was approaching a critical threshold. The compartmentalization protocols that had sustained her through 18 months of psychological suppression were beginning to deteriorate under the stress of escalating confrontation. Whitmore's campaign against her, no matter how pedestrian or crude his actual intentions might be, was pushing her toward a breaking point that the Defense Intelligence Agency's psychological conditioning hadn't adequately prepared her to handle. She had spent that final evening before the meeting sitting on her bunk, holding the photograph of James, and asking herself whether honoring her brother's sacrifice through years of psychological suppression was worth what it was costing her to maintain the deception. For the first time in 12 years, she hadn't been certain of the answer. The emergency alert sounded across Redstone Defense Installation at 1,347 hours on the morning of November 20th. Approximately 4 hours after Elena had left Captain Whitmore's office with her hair brutally shorn and her psychological compartmentalization in active collapse. The alert was a precise, escalating tone that meant something catastrophic had happened to one of the facility's critical systems. It wasn't a drill. The tone pattern was wrong for drills. The timing was wrong. Everything about it communicated genuine emergency rather than routine training. Within minutes, base-wide communication systems reported that Redstone's primary research network had experienced a comprehensive system failure. All classified research databases were offline. All compartmented communication channels were non-functional. All access control systems were showing error messages instead of responding to legitimate authentication requests. The entire electronic infrastructure that made Redstone's research operations possible had simultaneously stopped functioning, as though someone had reached into the electromagnetic spectrum and switched off everything that depended on integrated circuit technology. Dr. David Chun had been in the Advanced Composites Research Division when the alarm sounded. He had immediately tried to access his primary research database and found nothing but error screens. He had attempted to communicate with other divisions using classified communication channels and discovered that those channels were dead. He had looked at Elena with the expression of someone watching the foundation of his entire professional existence crumble. "What's happening?" Chun had demanded, though his tone suggested he didn't expect Elena to have an answer. "All of our research access is gone. Everything is down." Elena had remained perfectly still, her hands folded on her workstation, her expression appropriately concerned but not panicked. Internally, she understood exactly what was happening. In the 4 hours since leaving Whitmore's office, her psychological compartmentalization had broken down completely. Commander Elena Vasquez, the consciousness that had been suppressed for 18 months, had seized full control of her personality. Lieutenant Elena Vasquez was now operating as a secondary personality layer, present but not dominant, observing but not directing. And Commander Elena Vasquez was demonstrating capabilities that would fundamentally alter everyone's understanding of who was actually working at Redstone. "I should check the security status," Elena had said calmly. There might be an official explanation coming through command channels. She had logged into a secure terminal using credentials that appeared legitimate but which actually provided access to classified systems well above her official clearance level. For 18 months, she had documented exactly how Redstone's security protocols could be manipulated. For 18 months, she had identified the vulnerabilities that would allow someone with proper training to access systems that should have been completely protected. And in the 4 hours since Whitmore had cut her hair, she had made the decision to demonstrate those vulnerabilities in ways that would force Redstone's leadership to understand exactly how exposed they actually were. The cascade of system failures that occurred over the next 6 hours represented the most comprehensive demonstration of facility vulnerability that the Defense Intelligence Agency had ever conducted. It wasn't random destruction. It was surgical precision applied to every critical system on the base. The primary research network came back online at 1,523 hours, but with all compartmented classifications stripped from the documents it contained. Every restricted access control marker had been removed. Every compartmented information barrier had been dismantled. Research materials that were supposed to be in separate, isolated storage systems were now displayed together in ways that would reveal how the compartmentation systems actually functioned in practice. At 1,604 hours, the facility's secondary communication network began displaying encrypted messages that appeared to be top-secret communications between various Redstone divisions. In reality, they were fabricated communications that Elena had created to demonstrate how the encryption protocols could be spoofed. They showed conversations between senior officers discussing operational capabilities in ways that revealed exactly what Research Redstone was actually protecting. By 1,700 hours, the facility's access control systems had been modified to accept any authentication credentials. Every classified area became accessible to any personnel who possessed even the most basic access badge. The security perimeter became essentially non-functional. Someone standing outside the fence could have walked into the most classified research area without any challenge from electronic security systems. And throughout all of this, Elena had remained at her workstation in the Advanced Composites Research Division, working calmly and deliberately through a terminal that connected her to systems that should have been completely isolated from her access. Dr. Chun had been watching her with growing confusion, then suspicion, then something that looked like horror as he began to understand that the woman who had been quietly working in his division for 18 months was somehow responsible for the systematic destruction of Redstone's electronic security infrastructure. "Elena," he had said finally, his voice tight with controlled panic. "What are you doing?" "Demonstrating," she had replied, without looking up from her terminal. "I'm demonstrating exactly how vulnerable this facility actually is." The revelation of Elena's true capabilities had rippled through Redstone like a shock wave. By 1800 hours, security personnel had received orders to locate and detain Elena Vasquez for questioning. By 1830 hours, she had been escorted to a secure conference room in the command section of the facility. By 1900 hours, Captain Whitmore had arrived at the conference room with the expression of a man whose understanding of reality had been fundamentally compromised. Across the table from Elena sat not just Whitmore, but Colonel Rebecca Hammond, who served as Redstone's deputy commander, and Major James Torres, her actual Defense Intelligence Agency handler, who had arrived at the facility via emergency transport the moment news of the system failures had been reported through intelligence community channels. "Commander Reeves," Torres had said, using her actual rank for the first time in 18 months. And the formality of the introduction had confirmed everything that Elena suspected about what was about to happen. "Your operational security has been compromised. We need to understand exactly what capabilities you've revealed and what classified information has been exposed during this demonstration." Elena had remained calm, her psychological compartmentalization now completely inverted. Commander Vasquez was in full control. The lieutenant persona was still present but subordinate, available if needed but not actively directing her responses. "All system failures can be reversed within 90 minutes, she had stated clinically. "No classified information has actually left the facility. All demonstrations utilized internal systems only. I have documented the specific vulnerabilities I've demonstrated and can provide comprehensive remediation recommendations for each one." Whitmore had been staring at her with the expression of someone trying to process information that contradicted every assumption he had made about military authority and institutional security. "You're not a communications specialist," he had said finally, as though stating the obvious might somehow make the reality of the situation more comprehensible. "No, sir," Elena had agreed. "I'm not. I'm Commander Elena Vasquez, United States Navy, assigned to the Defense Intelligence Agency's Advanced Reconnaissance and Penetration Division. I've been conducting a classified penetration operation at Redstone for the past 22 months under Project Sentinel Protocol." Colonel Hammond had closed her eyes briefly, the expression of a senior officer beginning to understand the scope of what had just occurred. Major Torres had remained expressionless, though Elena could detect the slight tension in his jaw that suggested he was already calculating the political and operational implications of what she had just demonstrated. "Your hair," Whitmore had said, his next statement revealing where his mind was actually focused. "You cut off your hair because of what I did." Elena had touched the roughly shorn ends of her hair without any emotional expression. "Your action physically assaulted a federal officer conducting classified operations. More significantly, it triggered a breakdown in the psychological conditioning protocols that allowed me to maintain my cover identity. The compartmentalization that sustained my performance for 18 months became unsustainable after the assault." She had paused, allowing her words to settle in the room. "I have spent 18 months documenting exactly how vulnerable Redstone's security infrastructure actually is. I have been operating under the assumption that I would have 8 more months to gather intelligence before demonstrating my capabilities in controlled ways designed to force institutional recognition of vulnerabilities without causing actual damage or compromising classified information." Elena had looked directly at Whitmore. "You accelerated that timeline by approximately 7 months, 8 days, and 4 hours. The question now is whether the Defense Department will use the time I've just purchased by exposing those vulnerabilities to actually improve security, or whether it will simply continue operating under the assumption that institutional authority is sufficient to protect classified information from sophisticated threats. The silence that followed had been absolute. Colonel Hammond had been processing the implications. Major Torres had been conducting rapid mental calculations about reporting structures and classification levels. And Captain Whitmore had been sitting with his hands on the table, staring at the woman whose hair he had cut, suddenly understanding that he had made a catastrophic error in judgment about who he was actually dealing with. Elena had spent 18 months proving that she could disappear entirely within military institutions. She had spent 18 months demonstrating the power of invisibility and suppression. And in the moment when her compartmentalization had finally broken, she had shown everyone at Redstone exactly why being invisible and suppressed might have been necessary in the first place. The cutting of her hair had been meant as punishment. Instead, it had been the catalyst that revealed capabilities that would reshape how the entire Defense Department understood its own vulnerability to sophisticated insider threats. The interrogation room at Redstone's security facility was deliberately austere. Concrete walls painted institutional gray, fluorescent lighting that created shadows beneath every person's eyes, and a metal table with 4 metal chairs that had been selected specifically because they offered no comfort and made any extended sitting uncomfortable. Elena had been in the room for 47 minutes when Captain Marcus Whitmore finally returned, this time accompanied by Colonel Rebecca Hammond and a man Elena didn't recognize but whose bearing suggested senior rank and direct authority. The man introduced himself as Major General Thomas Crawford, Deputy Director of Defense Intelligence Operations. His presence in the room meant that the incident had already escalated beyond Redstone's command structure and was now being handled at levels where classified operations were discussed and authorized by people with access to the President's daily briefing. Commander Reeves, Crawford had begun, his tone carrying the careful neutrality of someone who had spent decades separating emotion from decision-making in complex security situations. We need to understand the full scope of what you've demonstrated and what damage assessment we're dealing with regarding classified information exposure. Elena had remained calm, her psychological compartmentalization now fully inverted and stable in its new configuration. She was no longer performing invisibility. She was performing transparency, revealing exactly what she had learned and how she had learned it. General Crawford, she had replied, maintaining perfect military courtesy. All system demonstrations were conducted using internal networks only. No classified information has left the facility. No external communications were compromised. No classified material was accessed by unauthorized personnel. The demonstrations were designed to reveal vulnerabilities in how compartmented information is protected, not to expose the actual content of compartmented information. She had pulled out a comprehensive document that she had prepared during the 4 hours between leaving Whitmore's office and the system failures. A document that should not have existed, that violated multiple security protocols to create, but which comprehensively documented every vulnerability she had exploited. I have conducted a 22-month penetration assessment of Redstone's security infrastructure, Elena had continued. I have identified 247 distinct vulnerabilities in our compartmented information handling procedures, our access control systems, our communication encryption protocols, and our personnel security screening processes. I can provide detailed remediation recommendations for each vulnerability, along with specific documentation of how each vulnerability could be exploited by a sophisticated foreign intelligence service. Crawford had reviewed the document with the practiced eye of someone who had seen classified assessments for decades. His expression had remained neutral, but Elena could detect the slight tensing of his jaw that suggested he was processing information that was simultaneously more comprehensive and more damaging to Redstone's security posture than anyone in the room had anticipated. These are serious vulnerabilities, Crawford had said finally. How confident are you in your assessment? Completely confident, sir, Elena had replied. I have personally exploited each vulnerability documented in this assessment. Each exploitation has been documented with timestamps, technical specifications, and evidence of successful access to compartmented systems. This assessment isn't theoretical. It's based on 18 months of practical demonstration conducted without detection by any of Redstone's security personnel. Whitmore had been sitting rigidly in his chair, his face showing the strain of someone trying to maintain military bearing while experiencing psychological crisis. She penetrated our most classified research areas, he had said, his voice tight with stress. She accessed materials that should have required multiple security clearances. She was here under false pretenses. My pretenses were authorized by the Defense Intelligence Agency, Elena had corrected, her tone remaining professionally level. My cover identity was legitimate. My assignment was official. My mission parameters were clearly defined and approved at levels significantly above Redstone's command authority. Colonel Hammond had leaned forward slightly. Commander Reeves, can you explain why you felt compelled to conduct the system demonstration today? Your original mission timeline extended 8 more months. What changed? Elena had understood that this was the critical question, the one that would determine whether she was perceived as a professional operative conducting an authorized operation or as someone who had gone rogue and acted beyond her operational parameters. At 0600 hours this morning, Captain Whitmore conducted what he characterized as a disciplinary action. Elena had begun, choosing her words with precise care. During this action, he physically assaulted me while simultaneously lecturing me about military discipline and respect for the chain of command. The physical assault involved cutting my hair against my will while maintaining forceful physical contact designed to prevent me from avoiding injury. She had paused, allowing the statement to settle. My psychological conditioning protocols were designed to allow me to maintain my cover identity under significant operational stress. However, those protocols were not designed to accommodate the specific combination of physical assault by a command officer combined with ideological justification for that assault. The contradiction between military professionalism and the unprofessional assault triggered a cascade failure in my compartmentalization protocols. Elena had looked directly at Whitmore. 18 months of psychological suppression became unsustainable in the face of being treated as though I deserved punishment for daring to question flawed security procedures. When my ability to maintain compartmentalization failed, my observer consciousness, the consciousness that had been documenting vulnerabilities for 18 months, became dominant. At that point, continuing to pretend that Redstone's security was adequate became impossible. Crawford had been taking notes with methodical precision. You're asserting that Captain Whitmore's actions directly triggered the demonstration. I'm asserting that Captain Whitmore's actions made my continued cover performance untenable, Elena had clarified. The timing of the demonstration was accelerated because maintaining my false identity became psychologically impossible after the assault. However, the demonstration itself was inevitable. The vulnerabilities I've documented are real. They would have been revealed in 8 months through planned channels. The assault simply accelerated that revelation by approximately 7 months. Whitmore had stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the concrete floor with a sound that echoed in the austere room. This is insane, he had said, his voice rising. She's a junior officer who conducted espionage operations against a military facility. She should be arrested and charged with multiple federal crimes. She should be decorated, Crawford had replied, his tone carrying the cold authority of someone whose decisions couldn't be challenged in a room with active military personnel present. Commander Reeves has demonstrated that this facility's security infrastructure is inadequate to protect classified information from sophisticated insider threats. The Defense Department has been searching for someone to conduct exactly this kind of assessment for 3 years. The fact that she did it while maintaining a cover identity that not a single person at this facility detected is precisely why this operation was authorized in the first place. Crawford had turned his attention back to Elena. Commander, your operation has revealed that Redstone's current security procedures are fundamentally inadequate. What do you recommend as the next phase of your operation? Elena had recognized the significance of the question. Crawford wasn't investigating her actions. He was asking how she wanted to proceed with her mission now that her cover identity had been compromised and her true capabilities were known to the entire Redstone command structure. The vulnerabilities I've documented require comprehensive remediation, Elena had responded. That remediation needs to begin immediately, starting with the personnel security screening processes that failed to detect that I was conducting classified operations under false identity for 18 months. I recommend that I transition to an open role where I can work directly with Redstone's security officer to implement the specific procedural changes that will address each documented vulnerability. And Captain Whitmore? Crawford had asked, the question framing Whitmore as a separate issue that needed to be resolved independently of Elena's mission continuity. Elena had considered her response carefully. She had every justification to demand whatever consequences she wanted imposed on Whitmore. His actions had damaged her psychological stability and accelerated her operational timeline. His assault had been unprovoked and unjustified. His inability to recognize competence when he encountered it had demonstrated the exact kind of institutional blind spot that her mission was designed to expose. But Elena understood something that Crawford probably understood as well. Whitmore was a symptom of a larger institutional problem, not the root cause of that problem. Redstone was full of commanders like Whitmore, men who believed that authority derived from rank rather than capability, who were threatened by competence they couldn't control, who used administrative authority as a substitute for actual leadership. Captain Whitmore's actions represent the institutional problem that made this facility vulnerable in the first place, Elena had said finally. He operated under the assumption that his authority as base commander was sufficient to control any situation, including situations involving threats he didn't understand. He demonstrated that military leaders at this facility confuse rank with capability and authority with competence. That confusion is a security vulnerability. However, punishing Captain Whitmore personally won't address the systematic failure that allowed him to believe his behavior was acceptable in the first place. She had paused, recognizing that what she was about to say crossed the line between professional assessment and personal judgment. I recommend that Captain Whitmore be relieved of command and reassigned to a position that doesn't involve direct authority over personnel conducting classified research. More importantly, I recommend that Redstone implement comprehensive command development training that specifically addresses the vulnerability created when military leaders confuse institutional authority with professional competence. I recommend that this training be mandatory for all base commanders throughout the Defense Department. Crawford had nodded slowly. That's a comprehensive assessment, Commander. I'll ensure those recommendations are included in my report to the Secretary of Defense. For now, you're relieved of all undercover operations. You'll transition to a classified advisory role, reporting directly to my office. You'll work with Redstone's new command structure. Colonel Hammond will assume command of the facility effective immediately to implement remediation procedures. Crawford had stood, indicating that the interrogation was concluded. As he turned toward the door, he had paused and looked back at Elena. Commander Reeves, what Captain Whitmore did was wrong. But what you did, what you endured for 18 months, and how you used your capabilities to reveal institutional vulnerabilities instead of exploiting them for personal benefit, that's precisely what separates professional operators from people who simply have access to classified systems. The Defense Department is fortunate to have officers like you. After Crawford left the room, Elena had remained at the metal table, her hands folded in front of her, her newly shortened hair falling around her face as a permanent reminder of the moment when everything had changed. For 18 months, she had lived as a ghost. And in the moment when she had finally stopped pretending to be invisible, she had revealed not just vulnerabilities in military security, but something more significant, the power that comes from understanding your own strength and using it not for personal dominance, but for institutional improvement. 6 weeks after Captain Whitmore was relieved of command and Major General Crawford authorized Elena's transition to open operational status, the Defense Intelligence Agency's Advanced Reconnaissance and Penetration Division had established a secure review center at Redstone specifically designed to assess the implications of Elena's vulnerability documentation. The review center occupied an entire building that had been cleared of all previous personnel and repurposed as a classified assessment facility where the most sensitive aspects of her penetration operation could be analyzed without being exposed to the broader military personnel population at Redstone. The team assembled to review Elena's work represented some of the most senior security professionals in the Defense Department. There was Dr. Patricia Mercer, the Defense Department's Chief Information Security Officer, who had spent 30 years designing systems intended to prevent exactly the kind of penetration that Elena had conducted. There was Colonel James Bradford, the commander of the Defense Intelligence Agency's Cyber Operations Division, whose expertise in understanding electronic vulnerabilities made him uniquely qualified to assess Elena's documented exploits. There were representatives from the National Security Agency, the Defense Information Systems Agency, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all of them present because Elena's assessment raised questions about the security of classified information handling across the entire Defense Department. The documentation that Elena had created over her 22 months at Redstone was remarkable in its thoroughness. It wasn't just a list of vulnerabilities. It was a comprehensive map of how classified information actually moved through Redstone systems, where the gaps existed between theoretical security and practical security, and exactly how a sophisticated operator could exploit those gaps without triggering any of the security mechanisms that were supposed to prevent such exploitation. Dr. Mercer had spent 3 days reviewing Elena's documentation on compartmented information handling before she finally met with Elena in the Review Center's secure conference room. "Commander Reeves," Mercer had begun, and Elena had noted that the formal use of her rank and title was being employed consistently now by everyone who worked in the Secure Review Center. "Your assessment of how compartmented information is actually being handled at Redstone contradicts every assumption that the Defense Department has made about compartmented security for the past 2 decades. My assessment is based on practical observation and documentation," Elena had replied, maintaining her professional demeanor. "I didn't make assumptions about how compartmentation works. I documented how it actually functions when people try to access compartmented information across organizational boundaries." Mercer had pulled up a specific section of Elena's documentation on her secure terminal. "You identified that 23% of classified materials that are supposed to be compartmented as restricted access can actually be accessed by personnel whose security clearances don't authorize access to those materials. How is that possible?" "Because the people who designed the compartmentation systems assumed that compartmented information would always be requested and accessed in ways that aligned with organizational responsibilities," Elena had explained. "If someone from the Advanced Composites Research Division needs to access materials from the Quantum Computing Division, the assumption is that their supervisor would submit an official request for cross-divisional access. The compartmentation systems are designed to control access through formal approval channels." She had pulled up her own documentation showing specific examples. "However, if someone understands how the approval channels actually work, they can determine that certain supervisors routinely approve cross-divisional access requests from their subordinates. That pattern becomes predictable. Once something becomes predictable, it becomes exploitable. I documented 17 different supervisors whose approval patterns were sufficiently consistent that I could reasonably predict when they would approve specific types of access requests. That predictability allowed me to access compartmented materials that I technically shouldn't have been authorized to access." Colonel Bradford had been listening intently, and Elena could see him making calculations about how significantly this vulnerability could compromise classified information security across multiple installations. "How many military facilities do you estimate have the same vulnerability?" he had asked. "All of them," Elena had replied without hesitation. "This vulnerability isn't specific to Redstone. It's inherent to how compartmented security systems are implemented across the Defense Department. The systems work by controlling formal access channels. They fail when someone understands how supervisors actually make decisions about cross-divisional access in practice. That failure exists everywhere that compartmented information is handled, because it's not a technical failure. It's an institutional behavior failure." The review process had extended over 6 weeks, with Elena working directly with the assessment team to not just identify vulnerabilities, but to understand the root causes of those vulnerabilities. What had emerged was a sobering picture of how classified information could be compromised by sophisticated operators who understood human behavior as thoroughly as they understood technical systems. The vulnerability documentation had been compiled into what was officially classified as Assessment Report, Security Vulnerabilities, in Defense Department Classified Information Handling Procedures. Unofficially, it became known throughout the intelligence community as the Redstone Report, a comprehensive assessment that would reshape how the entire Defense Department approached classified information security. The implications of Elena's assessment began to ripple through military bureaucracy in ways that no one could fully control. Within 3 weeks of the initial Review Center assessment, the Secretary of Defense had ordered a comprehensive security audit of all major military installations using Elena's vulnerability framework as the baseline assessment tool. Within 2 months, preliminary results from that audit suggested that the vulnerabilities Elena had identified at Redstone existed at approximately 78% of assessed installations. News of the vulnerability assessment reached Capitol Hill through the Defense Intelligence Agency's Congressional Liaison Office. Senators on the Armed Services Committee began requesting briefings about how classified information could be compromised so comprehensively. Representatives on the House Select Committee on Intelligence started asking questions about what the Defense Department was doing to fix the vulnerabilities that Elena had revealed. Elena found herself providing classified testimony to multiple congressional committees about the nature of the vulnerabilities she had documented and the systemic factors that made those vulnerabilities possible. In each appearance, she maintained professional composure while explaining in clear language exactly why military leaders' assumption that compartmented security systems would protect classified information had proven dangerously naive. The fundamental problem, Elena had testified to the Senate Armed Services Committee in a closed classified hearing, is that compartmented security systems are designed to control access to information through formal approval channels. However, approval channels are administered by human beings, and human beings are predictable. Once someone understands how a supervisor makes decisions about approving access requests, they can reasonably predict when that supervisor will approve future requests. That predictability creates exploitable patterns. She had paused, allowing the senators to process the implications of what she was saying. Foreign intelligence services understand this vulnerability intimately. They train their operatives to recognize predictable behavior patterns and exploit them. The fact that the Defense Department's compartmented security systems are vulnerable to this kind of exploitation isn't a failure of the systems themselves. It's a failure of the institutional understanding of how security actually works when human behavior is factored into the equation. The testimony had generated significant media coverage. Classified portions had been carefully protected, but the unclassified bottom line, that the Defense Department's approach to protecting classified information had proven inadequate to the threats it faced, had become public knowledge. News organizations reported that a Defense Intelligence Agency officer had exposed systematic vulnerabilities in how the military protected its most sensitive information. Captain Marcus Whitmore's name had not been mentioned in any official reporting about the incident, but word had spread through military channels about the role his actions had played in triggering the vulnerability assessment. He had been reassigned to a non-command position at the Pentagon, his career trajectory irreversibly altered by the decision to use scissors and physical assault as tools for asserting authority over someone he had fundamentally misunderstood. Elena had been offered commendations, promotions, and opportunities for various specialized assignments throughout the Defense Department. She had declined most of them, preferring instead to remain at Redstone in her newly created position of Deputy Director for Security Assessment, where she could work directly with Redstone's new commander, Colonel Rebecca Hammond, to implement the specific remediation procedures that would address the vulnerabilities she had documented. The truth about what had actually happened at Redstone, the full story of Elena's 22 months of classified operations, Captain Whitmore's assault, and the cascading consequences of that assault, remained compartmented in classified files accessible only to people with appropriate security clearances and need-to-know authorization. But within the intelligence community, the story had become legendary. There was the operator who had spent nearly 2 years living as a ghost, documenting every weakness, documenting every vulnerability, and then, when her compartmentalization had been shattered by petty authoritarianism, had demonstrated her capabilities in ways that had forced an entire government agency to recognize systemic failures it had been ignoring for decades. The woman whose hair had been cut as punishment had become the person who reshaped how an entire military department understood its own vulnerabilities. The lieutenant whose true identity had been hidden had become the commander whose real capabilities were becoming recognized as some of the most significant contributions to Defense Department security in the past 2 decades. Elena continued her work at Redstone, no longer invisible but no longer performing invisibility either. She existed in a space between her past compartmentalized consciousness and her current integrated identity. She carried the leather-bound notebook with its 187 entries, though the entries now continued beyond the invisible line that had separated her lieutenant persona from her commander consciousness. She still kept the photograph of James, but she no longer needed to lock it away or carry it in hidden compartments. The evidence of her suffering, her shorn hair growing back, her psychological wounds healing, her identity reassembling itself after the trauma of compartmentalization, was becoming visible to people around her. And that visibility, she was learning, was far more powerful than the invisibility that had sustained her through 18 months of calculated deception. 18 months after the hair-cutting incident that had triggered the collapse of her compartmentalization and the revelation of her true capabilities, Elena Vasquez stood in front of an auditorium full of military officers at the Pentagon's Institute for Strategic Intelligence, preparing to deliver the keynote address at the annual conference on Defense Department security protocols. Her hair had grown back to shoulder length, styled with the kind of professional precision that suggested someone who had learned to present herself as both approachable and formidable. The scar on her scalp where Whitmore's scissors had caught her skin had faded to invisibility, visible only if someone knew exactly where to look. The auditorium contained approximately 400 military officers, colonels, generals, senior command staff from installations throughout the Defense Department. People whose job it was to make decisions about how military organizations protected classified information and how they understood security vulnerabilities. Elena had been invited to speak about the lessons learned from her penetration operation at Redstone, but more significantly, she was being invited to help reshape institutional thinking about what security actually meant in organizations where human beings were responsible for protecting classified information. She had titled her presentation, "The Invisible Threat: Understanding Vulnerabilities That Organizations Can't See." The most dangerous security vulnerabilities, Elena began, her voice carrying through the auditorium with the quiet authority of someone who had earned the right to speak on these subjects through experience rather than theory, are not the ones that appear in technical security assessments or that show up in penetration testing reports. The most dangerous vulnerabilities are the ones that hide in plain sight because they're intertwined with how people actually make decisions about power, authority, and institutional hierarchy. She activated the first slide of her presentation, which displayed a photograph of Redstone Defense Installation as seen from the air. "I spent 22 months inside one of the most secure military installations in America, documenting vulnerabilities that existed not because the technical systems were inadequate, but because the institutional understanding of what actually creates security was fundamentally flawed." Elena discussed the specific vulnerabilities she had identified at Redstone, but she framed them not as failures of individual personnel or specific organizations, but as systemic failures that existed wherever compartmented information was handled and wherever human beings made decisions about how to protect classified information. "The core vulnerability," she explained, "is the assumption that institutional authority is sufficient to protect classified information. We train commanders to believe that their rank gives them the authority to make security decisions. But rank doesn't give you understanding. Authority doesn't give you competence. And the moment someone confuses authority with competence, they become a security vulnerability themselves." She displayed a slide showing the specific vulnerabilities in supervisor approval patterns that she had documented. "I identified supervisors whose behavior was so predictable that I could reasonably forecast when they would approve access requests to compartmented materials. That predictability wasn't because those supervisors were incompetent. It was because they had developed patterns of decision-making based on their understanding of institutional authority and their role in the organizational hierarchy. Once those patterns became predictable, they became exploitable." The audience was listening with the kind of intensity that suggested Elena had articulated something that people had been sensing but hadn't been able to express in professional language. Command officers throughout the Defense Department had been struggling to understand how classified information could be compromised despite having security systems in place that should theoretically prevent such compromise. Elena was providing a framework for understanding those failures not as isolated incidents, but as systemic vulnerabilities that could be identified and addressed through institutional change. "The solution isn't to punish people who make predictable decisions," Elena continued. "The solution is to fundamentally change how we train military leaders to think about what creates security. We need to move from a model where security is created through authority to a model where security is created through understanding. Commanders need to understand how their decisions about compartmented information handling actually impact classified information protection. They need to understand the specific patterns of human behavior that make compartmented information vulnerable to exploitation." She paused, knowing that what she was about to say would challenge some fundamental assumptions in the room. "We also need to acknowledge that military rank and institutional authority can become obstacles to security if those with authority refuse to recognize threats they don't understand. If someone tells you that a junior officer has identified a security vulnerability in your procedures, your first instinct shouldn't be to defend your authority. Your first instinct should be to understand whether that officer might be right. The final slides of her presentation shifted to more positive themes. Specific remediation procedures that had been successfully implemented at Redstone over the past 18 months, showing measurable improvements in how compartmented information was protected and how vulnerabilities could be identified and corrected before they could be exploited. The transformation that Redstone has undergone in the past 18 months provides evidence that institutional security can be significantly improved if organizations are willing to acknowledge vulnerabilities and implement systemic changes, Elena concluded. Colonel Rebecca Hammond, who assumed command of Redstone after the previous command structure failed to recognize the vulnerabilities that I had documented, has demonstrated that commanders who prioritize understanding over authority can create genuinely secure organizational environments. She displayed a final slide showing Redstone's updated security procedures, the implementation timelines, and the measurable improvements in how compartmented information was being handled. The vulnerabilities I identified at Redstone exist at 78% of assessed Defense Department installations. But the remediation procedures that have been successfully implemented at Redstone can be replicated at every other installation. The question isn't whether we can fix these vulnerabilities. The question is whether military leadership has the humility to acknowledge that authority and understanding are not the same thing. When Elena finished speaking, the auditorium erupted in applause that continued for nearly 2 minutes. Senior command officers stood, acknowledging not just the quality of her presentation, but the significance of what she had revealed about institutional vulnerabilities that had previously remained invisible to military leadership. After the formal presentation concluded, Elena spent 2 hours meeting with individual commanders who had specific questions about how to identify and address vulnerabilities in their own commands. Each conversation followed a similar pattern, officers asking Elena to help them understand security vulnerabilities that they had been sensing but hadn't been able to articulate or address within their institutional structures. That evening, Elena returned to her quarters at the Pentagon Officers Club, where she had been staying during her 3-day conference visit. She opened her leather-bound notebook and added a new entry, dated 18 months after the initial compartmentalization collapse. The mission has transformed. What began as an operation to document vulnerabilities has become a mandate to reshape institutional understanding of what security actually means. The vulnerabilities I identified at Redstone weren't unique to that installation. They exist everywhere that human beings make decisions about protecting classified information. The work of addressing those vulnerabilities will extend far beyond my initial operation. Others will now carry forward the effort to help military leadership understand that authority and competence are not the same thing, and that genuine security requires humility about the limits of one's understanding. She paused, thinking about James and the reason she had originally volunteered for the compartmentalization and the 18 months of psychological suppression. James died because security systems failed to recognize threats that were visible if anyone had been looking in the right direction. I spent 18 months becoming invisible so that I could identify the blind spots that had allowed his death to occur unnecessarily. Now I'm spending my time making those blind spots visible to military leadership. The sacrifice of compartmentalization has transformed into a mission of institutional transformation. The invisible threat has become the visible path to change. Elena closed the notebook and looked at the photograph of James that now sat openly on her desk, no longer hidden in protective compartments or locked away behind security considerations. The woman whose hair had been brutally cut as punishment had become the person who reshaped how an entire military department understood its own vulnerabilities. The officer who had spent 22 months suppressing her true identity had emerged with that identity integrated, visible, and recognized as one of the most significant contributions to Defense Department security transformation in decades. But more importantly, she had honored her brother's sacrifice by ensuring that the institutional failures that had contributed to his death would never again go unrecognized or unaddressed. Every military leader she helped educate about security vulnerabilities was a step toward preventing future Jameses from dying because security systems failed to recognize threats that should have been obvious to anyone who understood what security actually required. The mission continued, but now it was a mission conducted not in shadows and compartmentalization, but in the light of acknowledged expertise and recognized authority. And that transformation from invisible operative to visible authority was the true legacy of the moment when Captain Marcus Whitmore had decided that cutting someone's hair was an appropriate expression of military discipline. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.